Welcome, my friends, to Twisted Roots, a place where family stories twist and turn, where love collides with pride, and where the lessons often arrive in the most unexpected ways. If you believe that every family carries hidden truths, that every father holds a story deeper than appearances, then I invite you to stay with me until the very end. And if you feel these stories matter, subscribe, join our growing family, and walk with us through tales that remind us what respect, love, sacrifice truly mean. Tonight's story carries a title heavy with betrayal and redemption. My son called me dead weight, then the board called me founder. The word still echoes in my chest, dead weight. It was my own son who said it, not behind my back, not in a whisper, but boldly right there in the glittering hall of a downtown Chicago hotel. Crystal chandeliers above us, silver cutlery ringing on fine china, the smell of wine as red as pride filling the air. Around us sat executives in tailored suits, the kind of men who measured worth by stock options and corner offices. And my son, my own flesh and blood, introduced me to them as nothing more than a burden. He didn't even flinch. He smiled when he said it. He thought it was clever. He thought it placed him higher in their eyes, to point at the man who had raised him and call me useless, dead weight. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell the truth. Because when you've lived long enough, you learn that truth doesn't always need a stage. Sometimes truth prefers patience. I remember clutching my glass of water, watching the ice melt into nothing, and thinking how strange it was that my son saw only an old man in a modest jacket, while the very building we stood in, the very company that paid for his expensive tie, had my fingerprints buried deep in its foundation. He saw wrinkles where once there had been sleepless nights working through code. He saw shaky hands, never knowing those same hands once signed incorporation papers with a friend in a garage that smelled of oil and hope. He saw dead weight. What he didn't see was the truth. That weight was the burden I had carried for decades, carrying him, carrying his future. Carrying a dream so heavy that it nearly broke me in half before it blossomed into the company he now boasted about at cocktail parties. But I said nothing, because sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. Sometimes you let arrogance rise like a balloon, just so you can watch how high it floats before reality pops it. That night, as his colleagues laughed politely and turned back to their expensive meals, I looked at my son and I knew, one day soon he would learn. He would learn that respect cannot be bought, that dignity cannot be measured by the price of a suit, and that some men carry their legacy not on their sleeves but quietly, like cufflinks kept in a velvet box, waiting for the right moment to shine, and I, patient as time itself, would be there when the lesson arrived. Retirement is a strange word. To some it means freedom, to others it means irrelevance. To me it has always meant camouflage. Most mornings I wake before the sun. The house is quiet then, the world outside still stretching its arms awake. I sit at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, plain, black, no sugar. The steam curls upward like a ghost, and I let it wash over me as I listen to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock. If you walked into my house, you'd think it belonged to any ordinary man at the end of his career. The furniture is comfortable but worn, the curtains a little faded. There are no grand displays of wealth, no hints of the empire I once helped build, and that is the point. In the living room there are photo frames of birthdays, graduations, and Thanksgivings where the turkey always seemed too dry. They show the story of a father present but never flamboyant. A father who kept his head down, who provided without boasting. My son sees those pictures and remembers a man with modest clothes and second-hand cars. He does not remember the nights when those cars were parked outside the office at 2 a.m., when I was still inside with my partner, mapping the skeleton of the company he now calls his. Sometimes, after breakfast, I walk into my study. I keep it locked most of the time. Not because there are secrets too terrible to be revealed, but because some truths must wait for the right eyes, the right moment. On the walls hang quiet trophies, the first patent certificate, yellowed at the edges, a photograph of two young men in a cluttered garage, faces smudged with sweat and stubbornness. A framed copy of Forbes that once called me the quiet revolutionary of AI innovation. And then there's the little wooden box in the desk drawer. Inside it rests a pair of cufflinks, silver, engraved with a logo my son sees every morning when he walks into the glass building downtown. To him, that logo means prestige, opportunity, a paycheck. To me, it means years of sacrifice, long before he was old enough to tie his own shoes. But I don't show him these things. Instead, I tend to my garden. I trim the hedges, I water the tomatoes. Neighbors wave as they jog by. And I wave back like any retiree enjoying the slow rhythm of days. My son thinks the garden is all I have now, that I am done, finished, a man whose only work is pulling weeds, and maybe that's why his arrogance stings less than it should. He doesn't know better, how could he, when I've let him believe the mask I wear? Still, there are moments when his words reach me, small cuts that open old scars. At dinner last month, he laughed across the table, saying, "Dad, you wouldn't last a day in my world. Business moves too fast for people stuck in the past." I smiled, lifted my glass of water, and said nothing, because sometimes a father's silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is a seed quietly planted, waiting for the right season to bloom. If you ask my son, he would tell you he was on top of the world. Every morning he put on his navy suit like armor, knotted his silk tie with the precision of a soldier, and checked his reflection twice before leaving the mirror. The car he drove to work gleamed with newness, the kind of polished steel that announces itself even before the driver steps out. And when he walked through the revolving doors of Technova, the company he believed was his proving ground, his stride carried a rhythm of ownership, as if the building had been built just to house his ambition. To his colleagues, he was confident, charming, a man who knew how to sell a product and himself in the same breath. They admired his numbers, his drive, his ability to work long hours. They saw him as the future of the company, and he believed them. He often spoke of efficiency and innovation, as though these words were inventions he himself had discovered. He boasted about the 40% growth his department had achieved, never realizing that the foundation of those profits had been poured long before he learned to pronounce the word revenue. At home, his pride began to take on a different tone. He looked at me, his father, through the eyes of a man who believed he had outgrown his teacher, when he called me retired. The word was dipped in condescension, as though I had given up rather than chosen to step back. Once, over dinner with colleagues, he patted my shoulder and said, "My dad's between opportunities right now." The table chuckled politely, and I felt my daughter's hand squeeze mine under the tablecloth, but my son did not notice. He was too busy grinning, as if he had scored a clever point in a game only he was playing. I did not answer him, not then, not yet. Because what he could not see was that arrogance often comes before a fall, and the higher a man climbs on his own ego, the harder gravity eventually pulls him down. But he was young, hungry, and blind to the lessons that patience teaches. To him, I was just the man who clipped roses in the garden and lived in a modest house on the edge of town. He measured success by the car you drove, the title on your business card, and the applause in a crowded room. And he was about to discover how quickly applause can turn to silence. Family dinners are supposed to be safe places. The table is where laughter returns after long weeks, where stories are passed like bread, where fathers and sons can find each other again in the warmth of shared meals. But pride has a way of poisoning even the simplest gatherings. It was a Saturday evening, late spring. My daughter had invited us all to her home, my son, his fiancée, her younger cousins, and me. The table was set beautifully. Candles flickered against polished silverware, and the air smelled of rosemary chicken and fresh bread. For a moment, it felt like family the way it used to be, before ambition drew lines between us. I sat at the end of the table, listening more than speaking, content to watch my children laugh and argue about trivial things. But my son, as always, carried the conversation toward himself. He leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, and began describing his department's latest sales numbers. His voice grew louder, his gestures sharper. The younger cousins listened with wide eyes, impressed by the confidence in his tone. He thrived on their admiration the way a man thrives on applause. And then, as if the spotlight were not bright enough, he turned it on me. "You know," he said, his smile sharp, "Dad wouldn't really understand what it's like now. Business today moves too fast." His generation, he glanced at me, pausing just long enough for the sting to land. Well, let's just say they were built for simpler times. The table grew quiet. My daughter's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Even his fiancée shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but my son didn't notice. He pressed on, emboldened by his own words. "Honestly," he continued, "if Dad tried to step into my office for a day, he'd sink. No offense. But people your age, you can't keep up with the pace anymore. You'd be. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, searching for the word. Then he found it. Dead weight. The word hung over the table like smoke, thick and suffocating. No one laughed this time. Even the cousins, too young to understand the depth of the insult, sensed that something sacred had just been broken. My daughter stared at him, her eyes burning with anger. "How can you say that?" she snapped. "He's your father." But my son only shrugged, swirling his wine as if the matter were too obvious to debate. "I'm just being honest. Respect is earned, and the world doesn't hand it out for free. If you're not producing, if you're not driving results, you're a liability. It's just the way it is." I sat there in silence, my hands folded neatly on the table. I could feel every eye turning toward me, waiting for me to defend myself. But I didn't. I didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't remind him of the nights I came home so late he was already asleep, of the college tuition paid without question, of the sacrifices that had carved wrinkles into my face and calluses into my heart. Instead, I simply nodded as though he had made a reasonable point. My daughter's voice trembled with frustration. "Dad, you can't just let him talk to you like that." But I smiled faintly, touching her hand to calm her, because I knew something she didn't. Lessons taught in anger rarely last. Lessons lived in silence, however, they echo. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the laughter never quite returned, I walked home under a quiet sky. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the cool air felt like it carried my son's words with it. Dead weight. It would have been easy to break under the insult, to fire back with truths sharp enough to pierce his pride. But fatherhood is not about winning arguments. It's about guiding, even when the road is painful. Even when the child you raised no longer recognizes the hand that carried him. And so, as I turned the key in my front door, I whispered to myself the vow that would carry me forward. Let him reveal his true nature. Let him build his tower of arrogance. And when the moment comes, let the truth stand taller than pride. Because sometimes the most powerful answer a father can give is not spoken at all. It is lived. When I returned home that night, the house seemed quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort but unsettles. I placed my coat over the back of a chair and sat in the darkness for a long while, the word my son had spoken, dead weight, still echoing through my chest like a bell tolling in an empty church. I could have poured myself a drink. I could have turned on the television to drown the memory of that dinner in meaningless noise, but instead, I walked down the hallway to a door I rarely opened. My study. Most people, if they ever visited, would think it an ordinary room, shelves of books, a desk with scattered papers, the faint smell of leather and dust. But to me it was a sanctuary, a museum of sacrifices, and a vault of secrets that my children never fully knew. I flicked on the lamp. Warm light spread across the walls, revealing what I had kept hidden in plain sight. There, framed in dark wood, hung the incorporation papers of Technova, dated 1995, the signatures slightly faded but still sharp enough to pierce my heart with memory. Next to it, a black and white photo of two men, myself and Walter, standing in a cluttered garage, grinning like fools at a pile of wires and a computer that barely ran. We had nothing then but determination and coffee-stained notebooks. Yet in that nothing, we found a future. On another wall, Plaque Innovation Award 2003 for outstanding contribution to machine learning applications. My son had walked past this plaque 100 times when he was a teenager, but he never looked closely enough to notice whose name was etched into the metal. I opened the desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay the cufflinks, silver, engraved with the Technova logo. To anyone else, just accessories. To me, they were history distilled into metal. Walter had them custom-made years ago, a quiet reminder of how far we had come. I turned them over in my hand, the cool metal pressing against my skin. These cufflinks had never seen the light of day at family dinners or community gatherings. They waited, patient as I was, for the right moment. On the desk lay another artifact, a yellowed clipping from Forbes, headlined "The Quiet Revolutionary, Porter Wood and the Future of AI." I remember the day that article was published. My son was still in high school. He skimmed it once, shrugged, and went back to his video games. He never asked me about it. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he thought the future belonged to him, not the past. I leaned back in my chair, surrounded by these relics of battles fought and won. To the outside world I was retired, a gardener, a man living off his pension. To my son I was irrelevant. But in this room the truth breathed again. I was not dead weight. I was the foundation he stood on, the shoulders he climbed without ever looking down to see who carried him. And yet I did not feel anger. What I felt was patience. The patience of a craftsman watching a reckless apprentice swing his hammer carelessly, knowing sooner or later the apprentice would hit his own thumb and finally learn caution. I whispered into the empty room as if the walls themselves needed to hear it. Let him speak, let him believe. The higher he builds his arrogance, the farther the fall will reach. And when that day comes, the truth will not need my voice, it will speak for itself. I closed the velvet box, placed it back in the drawer, and shut off the light. Some fathers discipline with words, some with punishment, but the rarest lesson of all is the one delivered by time, patience, and the undeniable weight of truth. And in that hidden room, I knew my son's lesson was already on its way. If the dinner table was the first crack, then the office gala was the first real fracture. It was not the grand gala, the one with chandeliers and CEOs, that would come later. This was smaller, a company mixer held in one of those trendy rooftop lounges downtown. The kind of place where the skyline of Chicago became part of the decoration, where champagne glasses clinked against laughter, and where every rising manager sharpened their social skills like blades against each other. My son had invited me, or perhaps it is better to say he tolerated me. "Come on, Dad," he'd said with that impatient tone he often used when speaking to me, as if I were an old man fumbling with technology. "It'll be good for you to meet some of my colleagues. Just keep it simple, okay? Don't go on about the past." I nodded, though the words pressed against me like small stones in a shoe. He wanted me there, but invisible, present but silent. A prop to decorate his story. That evening I wore my plain gray jacket, the same one I used at church or community events. My son eyed it with a subtle grimace. He was in a navy suit that shone under the city lights, his tie knotted just so. He looked at me and sighed. "Try not to embarrass me, okay?" We arrived together, but as soon as we stepped onto the rooftop, he walked 2 steps ahead, as though the distance itself would rewrite the story of who we were. His colleagues gathered quickly, orbiting him like satellites around a small sun. He thrived in their attention, telling stories about sales pitches that closed, clients that bent to his persuasion, weekends sacrificed for quarterly numbers. I watched quietly from the side, sipping water while others sipped cocktails with names I could not pronounce. At some point he gestured toward me. "This is my father," said, his voice dipped in that polite tone reserved for introducing someone irrelevant. "He's retired now, enjoying the quiet life, right, Dad?" I gave a small smile. Yes, quiet has its own lessons. The group chuckled politely, but my son was not satisfied. He leaned in with mock seriousness. "My dad's old school. He doesn't really get what we're doing here. AI, predictive analytics, all that. He's more of a how should I put it?" His eyes searched for the word. I knew what was coming before it landed. A dead weight when it comes to this kind of conversation. The laughter was louder this time, though nervous. His colleagues glanced at me, unsure whether to join in or step back, but my son mistook their hesitation for admiration. He went on, emboldened. "You know, I keep telling him he should get a hobby. Golf maybe, something to keep busy. Otherwise, he just sits in his garden clipping roses. Isn't that right, Dad?" He expected me to laugh with them, to accept the caricature he had painted, but I only looked at him quietly, steadily. The silence unsettled the group more than words could have. One woman shifted her glass from one hand to the other. A man cleared his throat. "Your father must know a thing or two about business, though," someone offered kindly, trying to soften the moment. My son shrugged. "Well, sure, back in his day, but you know how it is. The world moves fast now. If you're not adapting, you're irrelevant." I set my glass down on the table. The sound of it against the wood was sharper than I intended, and it cut through their laughter. I smiled gently and said, "Sometimes relevance is not about keeping up with the race, but about having built the track in the first place." The words hung there. My son's smile faltered just for an instant, but he recovered quickly with a laugh. "See, that's Dad for you, always speaking in riddles." The group chuckled again, relieved, and the moment passed. But as I watched him bask in their shallow admiration, I realized something important. Arrogance is never satisfied with private victories. It seeks an audience. It thrives in public. That night, walking back to my car under the city lights, I understood that my son was not just embarrassing me. He was revealing himself piece by piece, word by word, to anyone who cared to look closely enough. And I knew then, with a certainty as sharp as the Chicago wind, that the stage for his greatest lesson had already been set. He was writing his own downfall, and all I had to do was let the ink dry. That night when I returned from the rooftop gala, I did not head straight to bed. The city lights still flickered in my mind, and my son's words clung to me like smoke that refuses to leave your clothes. Dead weight, a hobby to keep him busy, irrelevant. Each phrase, dropped so casually, was like a stone tossed into a well, vanishing quickly but echoing in the darkness long after. I walked into my study, flicked on the lamp, and stood for long while staring at the framed photographs and papers that lined the walls. They had been silent witnesses to my entire journey, my rise, my sacrifices, my battles, but now they were beginning to take on a new purpose. I pulled out a leather-bound notebook, one I had kept for years but rarely used. Its pages were thick, cream-colored, the kind meant to last. I uncapped a pen, sat down at my desk, and began to write. I wrote the date, then I wrote his words. My dad's old school, a dead weight when it comes to this kind of conversation. He should get a hobby, otherwise he just sits in his garden clipping roses. If you're not adapting, you're irrelevant. I wrote them down not out of spite, but out of clarity. Words have a way of slipping away if you let them, but on paper they remain sharp forever. And I knew deep in my bones that a day would come when those words would be needed, not as weapons, but as mirrors. I leaned back, pen still in hand, and thought of my son. I remembered him as a boy, sitting cross-legged on the floor of that same study, asking me why the garage smelled of oil and wires, why I came home with circles under my eyes. Back then he looked at me as if I could build the world with my hands. Now he looked at me as though I could barely hold a pair of garden shears. How quickly children forget the shoulders that carried them. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The truth remains waiting. I turned another page and began to outline what I had come to realize. Arrogance, when left unchecked, is like a wildfire. It burns everything in its path: respect, love, trust, and my son was already fanning the flames, so I began my ledger, not just of insults, but of lessons, a plan still formless but growing, each entry a seed that would someday bear fruit. Lesson 1: respect is not optional, it is the currency of every relationship, personal or professional. Lesson 2: arrogance blinds. The higher you climb on pride, the harder the fall when truth arrives. Lesson 3: silence can be strategy, not weakness. Let him write his own downfall. I closed the notebook and placed it carefully in the drawer beside the cufflinks. Two artifacts now sat together, one that carried the story of what I had built and one that carried the story of what he had yet to learn. I turned off the lamp and stood in the darkness of the study, whispering a vow to myself. When the time comes, he will face his own words, and when he does, he will learn that respect is not granted to the loudest voice in the room, but to the one who earned it long before the room even existed. And with that, I left the study, carrying not bitterness but patience, the kind of patience only a father can have, waiting for the storm his child cannot yet see. At Technova, my son walked the halls with the confidence of a man who believed the future bent in his direction. His shoes clicked against polished marble floors, echoing like punctuation marks to his ambition. He was a rising star, and he wore the title proudly, Senior Manager of Corporate Sales. But behind the shine of his polished shoes and rehearsed speeches, there was something darker taking shape. In meetings, he began to speak of the old guard. Men and women who had been at Technova for decades, people whose hands still remembered the company's birth pains, who had bled themselves into the foundation just as I had. To my son, they were no longer mentors or pillars. They were obstacles. Dead weight, he called them once in a strategy session, his voice carrying across the boardroom table. We need to trim the fat if we're going to stay competitive. A silence followed. The kind that arrives when truth and cruelty are confused. Some nodded reluctantly, others stared down at their notes, unwilling to confront him. One older engineer, a man with gray at his temples and wisdom etched into his face, cleared his throat. Experience has its value, he said softly. We've weathered storms this company nearly didn't survive. Don't dismiss what got us here. But my son only smiled, leaning back in his chair. Experience without adaptation, replied, is just stagnation. The market doesn't reward nostalgia. His colleagues shifted in their seats. Some admired his boldness, others shrank from his arrogance, but my son didn't see the divide. He only saw himself rising. Later in the cafeteria, he laughed with a younger group of associates. Half these dinosaurs should have retired 10 years ago, he boasted. They're clogging up promotions that should belong to us. The company would run twice as fast without them." The younger employees chuckled, eager to please him. The older ones walked past in silence, their dignity heavy in their steps. What my son never realized was that words once spoken never vanish. They travel, they find ears, they settle into memories, and eventually they return, sometimes years later, sometimes sooner. Walter, my old partner, called me one evening. His voice carried the weight of concern beneath his usual calm. "Your boy," he said, "he's ambitious." No denying that, but ambition without respect is a dangerous fire. He talks too freely about people he should be learning from. People who have built this place with their blood. I listened, my heart heavy. "He doesn't know the foundation he stands on," I replied quietly. "Then maybe," Walter sighed, "it's time he learns." After we hung up, I sat in my study again, the notebook open before me. I added new entries. Lesson 4, respect the past, for it carries the wisdom of survival. Lesson 5, disrespecting others diminishes you, not them. I closed the book and rested my hand on the desk. My son thought he was building an empire of his own. In truth, he was building a stage, one where his words would come back to face him, with an audience larger than he ever imagined. And I knew with growing certainty that the gala to come would not just be another corporate celebration. It would be his reckoning. The invitation came wrapped in formality, printed on heavy cardstock with the Technova logo embossed in silver. My son handed it to me one evening as if it were an afterthought, sliding it across the table while scrolling through his phone. "Company dinner next week," he said casually. "It's at the Lakeview Grill. You should come." I looked at him, curious. "Why?" He glanced up briefly, impatience flickering in his eyes. "Because appearances matter. My colleagues will be there. My boss will be there. It'll look good if I bring you along." There was no warmth in the invitation, no desire to share an evening with his father. It was strategy, pure and simple. I wasn't a guest, I was a prop. The night of the dinner, I wore my plain charcoal suit, the same one I'd worn to weddings, funerals, graduations, nothing flashy, nothing new. My son eyed me with a tight smile when he picked me up. "It's fine," he muttered. "Just stay in the background, okay?" The Lakeview Grill was all polished mahogany and soft lighting, the kind of place where every detail whispered wealth. Waiters in crisp uniforms guided us to a long table near the window where city lights shimmered across the water. The table was already filled with executives, glasses of wine catching the glow of chandeliers. My son straightened his tie, his confidence swelling in the presence of his peers. He introduced me quickly, his tone brisk, dismissive. "This is my father. He's retired now, enjoying the quiet life. Retired, quiet life." The words landed like a polite dismissal, a way to file me neatly into irrelevance before the first course even arrived. One of his colleagues, a younger man with ambition shining in his eyes, nodded politely. "That must be nice," he said. "No deadlines, no pressure." My son smirked. "Yeah, Dad's got it easy, just puttering around the garden, reading the newspaper. He doesn't really get what we do now." He chuckled, and a few others joined in, the laughter polite but sharp enough to cut. I said nothing. I unfolded my napkin, laid it across my lap, and listened. As the evening went on, my son grew bolder. Perhaps it was the wine loosening his tongue or the glow of admiration from his colleagues, but he began to hold forth like a lecturer. "Business today is about speed," he declared, gesturing with his fork. "Adapt or get left behind, that's the reality. You can't coast on what you did 30 years ago. If you're not producing results now, you're dead weight." The phrase landed hard, dead weight. He didn't look at me directly, but the words were aimed close enough to sting. I set my spoon down gently, the clink against porcelain louder than I expected. My daughter, sitting across from me, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes pleading for me to respond, but I only smiled faintly and said, "Settling can be a choice." The table went quiet for a moment. My son blinked, then laughed, dismissing the edge in my tone. "See, that's Dad, always speaking in riddles." The laughter resumed, lighter this time, but the moment had lodged itself like a splinter under the skin. I let the silence settle, then steered the conversation elsewhere. "Tell me about Technova," I said calmly, my gaze fixed on my son. "What kind of solutions are you building?" He straightened proudly. "Cutting-edge machine learning algorithms, predictive analytics. Automated decision trees. We're revolutionizing corporate efficiency." His chest swelled as he spoke, his voice ringing with certainty. I nodded slowly. Impressive. He smiled, taking the compliment as proof of victory. But what he didn't notice was that I wasn't measuring his accomplishments. I was measuring his blindness. The dinner ended with toasts and promises of future success. My son basked in the glow of admiration, convinced he had shown his father's irrelevance and his own superiority. But as we left the Lakeview Grill, walking into the cool night air, I knew what he could not yet see, that every careless word he spoke, every insult cloaked in confidence, was being etched into a ledger he would one day be forced to read aloud. And the audience, when the time came, would be much larger than this table by the lake. By the time I returned home from the Lakeview Grill, the path ahead was clear. It wasn't just the sting of being called dead weight. It wasn't just the laughter of strangers echoing in my ears. It was the realization that my son had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. Respect once lost is harder to reclaim than money or status, and he was spending it carelessly as if he had an endless supply. I walked into my study that night and left the lights off. The moon spilled across the room, illuminating just enough, the outlines of framed awards, the sheen of old photographs, the faint glimmer of cufflinks inside their velvet box. I sat at my desk, opened the leather-bound notebook, and turned to a fresh page. My handwriting was steady, deliberate. Lesson 6, Pride without humility collapses under its own weight. Lesson 7, Arrogance thrives in the dark, but truth needs only one light to expose it. Then, below the lessons, I wrote 2 words in bold letters, the Gala, because I knew it was coming. Technova held its annual gala every spring, a grand affair where board members mingled with rising managers, where deals were whispered between glasses of champagne, where reputations were built or destroyed in a single evening, and my son, with his hunger for recognition, would never miss it. In the weeks that followed, I played my role as I always had, the quiet retiree, the gardener, the man who waved to neighbors while pruning his roses. My son continued his visits, dropping by now and then, each time with a new story of his successes, each time with another subtle jab. Dad, you wouldn't understand the pace we're moving at. Your generation had it easy compared to what we're doing now. You should come to the gala, it'll give you something to do. I listened, smiled, and wrote it all down later in my notebook, but behind the silence, I was preparing. I made a discreet visit to Armando's, the tailor on Michigan Avenue who had dressed me during my last years at Technova. He greeted me with warmth, still remembering the man I had been before I vanished into retirement. Together we chose a suit, charcoal gray, elegant but understated, the kind of suit that didn't shout wealth but whispered authority. Next, I visited the jeweler who had crafted the cufflinks years ago. I polished them carefully, running my thumb over the Technova logo etched in silver, knowing they would catch the light at just the right moment. Finally, I called Walter. Our conversation was brief, as it always was, but laced with familiarity. The gala's in a few weeks, I said. I'll be there, he replied. Will you? Yes. Then I suppose it will be a night to remember. I hung up, my pulse steady. This was not about revenge. It was about clarity, about giving my son a mirror so polished that he could no longer ignore his reflection. And so each day, I tended to my garden as though nothing had changed. I clipped roses, swept the porch, waved at neighbors. But in the evenings, under the quiet lamp of my study, I reviewed my notes, polished my cufflinks, and reminded myself of a simple truth. Some lessons can't be spoken into existence. They must be lived, revealed, and sometimes endured in front of an audience. And when the gala arrived, my son would discover that dead weight can sometimes be the very thing holding everything together. The weeks leading up to the gala unfolded like a stage being prepared for a play. Every time I saw my son, he spoke of it as if it were the pinnacle of his career, the crown jewel of his ambitions. This year is different, he told me one evening, standing in my kitchen with his tie loosened, wine glass in hand. The board will be there. Walter Klein himself will be there. If I play my cards right, Dad, I could walk out with a promotion, director, maybe even regional manager. Can you imagine? He didn't wait for me to answer. He was already rehearsing the applause in his mind. At family dinners, he bragged to his sister and cousins about his inside track at the company. I've outperformed every sales team in the Midwest, he declared between bites of roasted chicken. The numbers don't lie. The board can't ignore me forever. His fiancée, sitting proudly at his side, nodded eagerly. Derek's incredible. She said he works 60 hours a week sometimes. That's dedication. I glanced at my daughter, who shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had seen enough to know that hours do not equal wisdom, and pride is not the same as respect. But she kept her silence, perhaps trusting that time would reveal what words could not. Meanwhile, my son's arrogance spilled beyond family walls. At Technova, he began positioning himself openly for advancement. He hinted to colleagues about his vision for the future. He made casual remarks about which departments he would reshape once the promotion was his, and as always, he dismissed the older employees. "They've had their time," he said one afternoon over coffee with his peers. "This company needs fresh blood, people like us. The old guard is slowing things down. If I were in charge, I'd restructure tomorrow." His colleagues nodded, some out of agreement, others out of fear of being next in his line of fire. My son mistook their silence for respect. But what he didn't realize was that every word was building a record. Every boast, every careless insult, every arrogant prediction, they were the trumpets before a fall. At home, I watched quietly. I tended my garden, fixed the loose hinge on the back gate, paid my bills at the kitchen table. From the outside, nothing about me changed. To my son, I was still just the man with dirt under his fingernails and too much time on his hands. But inside my study, behind the locked door, the story was different. Suit was ready, hanging neatly in its garment bag. The cufflinks gleamed in their velvet box. The certified check sat folded in an envelope, a gift not just for my daughter's future, but for the moment of revelation it would carry. And each evening I opened the notebook and added another entry. Lesson 8, a man's words reveal him long before his resume does. Lesson 9, respect is not measured by hours worked, but by how you treat those who worked before you. Sometimes I caught myself staring at the old photograph on my desk, Walter and I in that cluttered garage, our faces lean with hunger and hope. I imagined what he would think when he heard my son speak of restructuring and dead weight. I imagined the silence in the room when truth finally broke through, and I found myself smiling not with malice but with certainty. Because arrogance can pretend for season, but truth has patience, and truth always arrives on time. The invitation to the gala arrived in a heavy cream envelope, its edges gilded with a shimmer that caught the afternoon light. My son brought it over himself as though its weight demanded ceremony. He placed it on my coffee table like a decree rather than an invitation. "This," he said, his tone serious, "is the most important night of my career. Everyone who matters will be there, the board, the executives, Walter Klein. Which means," he paused, eyes fixed on me, "we need to make sure you look the part." I raised an eyebrow. "Look the part?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if I were a child being instructed. "Dad, you can't show up in that old gray suit of yours. This isn't a family dinner. This is business. Appearances matter more than you think. People judge whether you like it or not. My boss, Walter, he notices everything. The way you dress, the way you carry yourself, even the way you speak." I let his words hang in the air. My old gray suit, the one I had worn to graduations, funerals, and anniversaries, carried more memories than he could count, but in his eyes it was just another relic like me. "What are you suggesting?" I asked calmly. "I'll take you shopping," he said quickly, relief flickering across his face as if he had solved a problem. "We'll get you something new, conservative but sophisticated. You can't stand next to me and look like," well, his voice trailed off, but the meaning was sharp enough to pierce. "Like what?" I asked, though I already knew. He forced a laugh. "Like you just came from tending roses in the backyard." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reveals nothing. "I see." The truth was, I had already been to Armando's weeks before. The suit was hanging in my closet, charcoal gray, perfectly cut, understated but dignified. The cufflinks were waiting, polished and ready to catch the chandelier light at just the right moment. He thought he was teaching me how to prepare, when in reality I had been preparing long before he even imagined it. "Don't worry, son," I said softly. "I know how to dress for an important evening." He looked at me skeptically, as if unsure whether to trust my judgment. "Good," he muttered finally, "because Walter's respect means everything. If he sees me with family who understand presentation, it only helps me. First impressions can make or break a career." First impressions. I nearly laughed at the irony. He believed Walter would be judging me. What he didn't know was that Walter and I had been judging boardrooms together for 30 years. back when career meant sleeping on an office floor, eating cold pizza at midnight, and fighting tooth and nail for a vision no one else believed in. But I didn't tell him that. I nodded, letting him believe he was in control of the story. Later that evening, after he left, I walked into my study. The garment bag hung neatly by the door. I unzipped it just enough to see the charcoal suit within, its fabric catching the lamplight with a whisper of authority. Beside it, in their velvet box, the cufflinks gleamed like patient witnesses. On the desk, my notebook lay open. I turned to a new page and wrote, Lesson 10, True dignity does not need costumes. It wears patience, humility, and truth. Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, but sometimes dignity borrows a suit, so the arrogant will pay attention. I closed the book, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence of the room settle around me. Outside, the garden waited for tomorrow's tending, the roses heavy with buds. But inside, a different kind of garden was blooming, one made of patience, memory, and carefully sown justice. The gala was no longer just an event, it was a stage, and whether my son knew it or not, he was about to deliver the performance of his life. The week before the gala, my son seemed to live on a stage of his own making. Every conversation, every gesture, every smile was rehearsed as though he were already basking in the spotlight of his promotion. At the office, he gathered colleagues around like an eager audience. This gala is it, he announced confidently, swirling a glass of whiskey at a downtown bar after work. The board will see what I've built. Walter Klein will see it. My department's up 40%. Who else can say that? No one. This is my year. The younger associates nodded, some with genuine admiration, others with forced smiles. They had learned that disagreeing with him carried its own cost. And when I'm promoted, he continued, lowering his voice to something conspiratorial. Things are going to change, streamlined processes, new blood. I've already got ideas on how to restructure. Some of the older folks, well, let's just say they've been coasting long enough. Laughter followed, thin, nervous, but my son heard only approval. At home, he was no less boastful. One evening he arrived at my house unannounced, brimming with restless energy. He paced my living room as though it were his personal boardroom. Dad, do you realize how close I am? Klein's going to be at my table. The directors will be watching. One good conversation, one strong impression, and I'm on the fast track. Regional manager within 3 years, maybe sooner. I sat in my armchair listening, my hands folded calmly in my lap. He didn't notice the irony when he added, but you'll have to promise me one thing, no riddles, no vague old man wisdom at the table. Just keep quiet, smile, let me handle everything. This is my moment. I nodded. Of course, son. He relaxed, mistaking my agreement for compliance, but inside I could already hear the echoes of the lesson forming. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I returned to my study. The notebook lay open, the pen waiting like an old friend. I wrote, Lesson 11, boasting is loud, wisdom is quiet. The louder the boast, the easier it is to break. Lesson 12, the future does not belong to those who trample the past, it belongs to those who honor it. I paused, then added beneath, final lesson pending. The gala will complete the record. The cufflinks gleamed beside the notebook, their silver edges catching the lamplight. I touched them gently, as though they were alive, witnesses to everything my son had dismissed. It struck me then that patience is a strange companion. It asks you to wait while every insult, every slight, every arrogant word cuts a little deeper. But patience also promises something in return. When the moment comes, it delivers justice with the weight of inevitability. I closed the notebook slowly. The ledger was almost complete. My son was certain the gala would mark the beginning of his reign. But for me, it would mark the end of my silence. The night of the gala arrived draped in velvet skies and the shimmer of city lights. Chicago's skyline glowed like a crown of steel and glass, and every beam seemed to converge on the towering hotel where Technova's grand event was being held. Valets in black uniforms opened the doors of luxury sedans. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant gowns flowed through the revolving doors like a river of ambition, each step echoing with the hunger for recognition. The marble lobby gleamed under chandeliers as if polished just for this evening. I arrived alone. My son had insisted I ride with him, but I chose otherwise. There are times when distance is necessary, times when a man must walk into a room not as a shadow, but as himself. The charcoal suit fit me like a second skin, its subtle pinstripes whispering dignity rather than shouting wealth. On my wrists, the cufflinks gleamed quietly, small, almost invisible to most eyes. but heavy with meaning for those who knew their story. I adjusted them once before stepping into the elevator, each polished edge a reminder of the years etched into my bones. Upstairs, the gala had already begun. A string quartet filled the air with music that danced lightly against the crystal walls. Waiters moved swiftly with trays of champagne, their steps rehearsed, precise. Conversations rose and fell like tides, figures of power trading words sharper than any blade. My son stood near the center of it all, laughter rolling easily from his lips. He was surrounded by colleagues, younger associates who looked at him with admiration, and older employees who listened with carefully concealed discomfort. His fiancée clung to his arm, radiant in a sapphire dress, proud to be tethered to what she believed was a rising star. When he spotted me at the edge of the room, his smile tightened. He excused himself quickly and strode toward me, adjusting his tie as though preparing for battle. "Dad," he said, his eyes scanning my suit, my shoes, my every detail. For once he hesitated. "You actually look good." "Thank you," I replied simply. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Just remember what we talked about. Don't try to impress anyone. Don't tell old stories. Just stand there, smile, and let me introduce you. This is my night, Dad. Please don't ruin it." His words carried urgency. Not cruelty this time. Fear threaded through his tone, the fear of being overshadowed. I only nodded. "I understand." He exhaled in relief, mistaking my calm for submission. Then, plastering his confident smile back on, he guided me toward his circle. "Everyone, this is my father," he announced, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby ears. "He's retired now, enjoying the quiet life in Evanston." A few polite nods, a few murmured greetings. To them I was background, a placeholder. And yet across the room I saw Walter. His posture was unmistakable. Even from a distance, straight-backed, commanding, his presence drawing attention without demanding it. He hadn't noticed me yet, but the moment he did, everything would change. For now, I waited. As the evening unfolded, my son's bravado swelled. He told stories of deals closed, numbers climbed, visions for the company's future. His colleagues listened, some impressed, some merely enduring. Between glasses of wine, he slipped in remarks about the old guard, about the need for fresh blood, about how companies shouldn't carry dead weight. The words hung in the air heavy, and I watched them fall into ears that remembered. I sipped my champagne quietly, letting him build his stage higher and higher. Patience, I reminded myself. Justice does not shout, it arrives like a tide, steady and undeniable. And as I caught Walter's eyes across the room for the briefest moment, I knew the tide was already turning. The gala was no longer just a celebration. It had become a mirror, and soon my son would be forced to look into it. The string quartet played softly in the background, their bows gliding across strings like whispers in the night. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell in polished rhythms. But beneath the music and the hum of conversation, the air at our table grew sharp, like glass ready to break. My son thrived in it. Surrounded by mid-level managers and a handful of board members' aides, he spoke with the conviction of a man certain that the world was his to command. His voice carried over the table. Confident, deliberate, tinged with the arrogance he mistook for charm. "You see," he said, leaning back in his chair with the ease of practiced self-assurance, "the problem with too many companies today is that they cling to the past. Old strategies, old leadership, people who don't understand the pace of today's markets. That's dead weight, and it holds everyone back." The word landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading silently across the table. A few of his colleagues shifted in their seats. One older woman pursed her lips but said nothing. A younger man forced a laugh, eager to stay in his good graces. And then, as if to punctuate his point, my son gestured lightly toward me with his wine glass. "No offense, of course. My dad here, well, he's retired now, enjoying the simple life, gardening, newspapers, things like that. He wouldn't last a day in the world we're in." The laughter this time was softer, hesitant. But it was enough. My son mistook their discomfort for agreement. I felt every eye glance at me, some with pity, some with quiet judgment, some with the weight of unspoken questions. But I remained still, the faintest of smiles resting on my lips, because silence in moments like these speaks louder than defense. Across the room I noticed Walter. He was standing near the stage, listening politely to a group of investors, but his eyes, sharp and practiced, had caught the shift at our table. He excused himself, his steps measured, his attention now drawn in our direction. Meanwhile, my son pressed on, emboldened by what he thought was momentum. The truth is, success belongs to those who adapt. The ones who hold onto the past, they slow us down. I've seen it at Technova firsthand. Departments clogged with people who should have stepped aside years ago. It's time for a new generation to lead. A hush fell over the group. One of the board members' aides coughed softly into her napkin, as if to disguise her discomfort. Another man looked down at his plate, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Still, my son didn't notice. He was too busy polishing his speech, too busy convincing himself that every word brought him closer to the promotion he craved. I lifted my glass of water, took a slow sip, and said nothing, but my gaze flicked briefly to Walter. He was moving closer now, weaving through the crowd with the unhurried steps of a man who knew his presence alone could silence a room. And in that moment I felt it, the shift in the air, the tremor before the break. The spotlight my son had built so carefully was about to turn, and he would discover that the brightness he adored could just as easily burn. The laughter around the table hadn't fully recovered from my son's last remark when the room shifted. It was subtle at first, the way conversations softened, the way a few heads turned as if pulled by gravity. Walter Klein was approaching. He moved with the kind of presence you can't manufacture, steady, unhurried, yet commanding. A man who didn't need to demand attention, because attention was already his the moment he entered a room. The board members respected him. The managers feared him, the employees admired him, and my son worshipped him, though he didn't yet understand the man he worshipped was also the mirror he would soon dread. "Gentlemen, ladies," Walter greeted warmly, his baritone voice carrying like music that quieted the quartet in the background. He rested a hand on my son's shoulder, light, casual, but firm enough to make him stand taller. "Derek, I hear you've been making quite an impression this evening." My son flushed with pride, his chest swelling as though the room itself now belonged to him. "Just sharing some thoughts about innovation, Mr. Klein," he said quickly. "The need for fresh energy, new ideas, the importance of trimming dead weight." Walter's smile flickered, not enough for most to notice, but I caught it, the faint narrowing of his eyes, the subtle pause before his reply. "Ah, dead weight." He repeated the phrase as though tasting it, weighing it. A strong phrase for such a young man. My son laughed nervously, mistaking caution for curiosity. "I only mean that businesses can't afford to carry people who aren't keeping up. If you're not moving forward, you're falling behind." Walter nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the table. "And tell me, Derek, do you think wisdom counts for nothing in that equation? Do you believe those who built the ground you walk on should be so easily cast aside?" The question dropped into the center of the table like a stone into still water. Conversations nearby faltered. Glasses hovered midair. Even the quartet's melody seemed to dim as though the violins had leaned in to listen. My son's smile faltered just slightly. "Of course not, Mr. Klein. I respect experience. I believe results matter more than history." Walter's eyes sharpened, though his tone remained even, almost gentle. "History is results, Derek. Without it, there would be nothing to build on, nothing to sell, nothing to boast about." The silence deepened. A bead of sweat traced my son's temple, though he masked it with another forced laugh. "Naturally, I didn't mean any disrespect." Walter let the moment breathe, then clapped my son on the back. "Good, because disrespect, Derek, is a debt that always comes due." The words lingered, heavy, final, the kind of words that don't need elaboration because they carry their own weight. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, eyes lowered as though I were simply another guest at the table. But inside, I felt the ground shifting beneath my son's feet. He didn't see it yet. He thought the moment had passed, that Walter's gentle smile meant forgiveness. But I knew better. Walter had heard enough. He had marked the words, and once Walter marked something, it never disappeared. My son returned to his stories after Walter moved on, but his voice carried a slight tremor now, the smooth edges dulled. He was still performing, still trying to dazzle. But doubt had crept into his performance, and I, silent, patient, only had to wait, because sometimes the most powerful role a father can play is not the speaker, but the witness. And tonight, the witness had more power than the loudest man in the room. After Walter drifted back into the crowd, the table exhaled as though it had been holding its breath too long. Glasses clinked again, forks found plates, conversation slowly resumed, but the air was not the same. Something unseen had shifted. My son tried to reclaim it. He straightened in his chair, forced a laugh, and leaned into a younger colleague. "Mr. Klein has a way of challenging people, doesn't he? He's old school, but you have to respect him. That's why I admire him so much. He's always pushing us to think bigger." The words came out smoother than he felt. His voice held a faint tremor, like a violin string just slightly out of tune. He sipped his wine quickly, as though the liquid courage would steady him. But I saw it, the tiny crack in the mask, the way his eyes darted briefly toward Walter's retreating figure, searching for reassurance that never came. The way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was watching. He was unsettled. For the first time in months, perhaps years, my son realized he was not untouchable. One of the older managers at the table, a man with salt and pepper hair and the weary look of someone who had weathered decades of corporate storms, spoke gently. "Sometimes, Derek, respect matters as much as results. Numbers rise and fall, character stays." My son forced a grin, too quick, too defensive. Of course, that's exactly what I was saying, but it wasn't, and everyone knew it. The conversation moved on, but his laughter was louder now, almost desperate, like someone patching cracks in a dam with bare hands. Every boast grew a little more exaggerated, every story stretched thinner, every smile a little too wide. He was trying to drown out the echo of Walter's words. "Disrespect is a debt that always comes due." I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was a mirror he could not control, and the reflection unsettled him more than any argument would have. Later that night, as the gala pressed deeper into its rhythms, dancing, toasts, photographs, my son hovered near Walter, trying too hard to catch his attention. I watched from a distance as he laughed a little too eagerly at Walter's jokes, gestured a little too broadly, nodded a little too quickly. The performance was obvious, and Walter, with his decades of discernment, noticed. Meanwhile, I slipped away to a quiet corner near the balcony. The city stretched below, alive with lights and noise, but out here the air was calmer. I leaned on the railing and let the cool wind brush against my face. In my mind, I could hear my son's voice at the dinner table weeks earlier, at the rooftop mixer, at the Lakeview Grill, dead weight, irrelevant, coasting on the past. I opened my notebook later that night, back in the solitude of my study, and added 2 final lines beneath the others. Lesson 13, the higher the mask, the harder the fall when it slips. Lesson 14, arrogance always builds its own stage for humiliation. I closed the book and rested my hand on its cover. The gala was not yet over. The true revelation still lay ahead, but for the first time I could feel it drawing near like a tide turning at sea, and I knew my son was not just walking toward his lesson anymore. He was running. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, each crystal casting splinters of light across the marble floor. The string quartet had given way to a jazz trio, their saxophone notes curling through the air like smoke. Waiters glided effortlessly, topping glasses of champagne that never seemed to empty. It was the hour when ambition tends to peak, when men loosen their ties, women laugh more freely, and conversations tilt toward bold declarations. And in that electric hum, my son found his stage. Walter had moved closer now, orbiting the clusters of executives, his presence drawing smaller groups into hushed circles. My son, sensing his chance, positioned himself carefully, near the center of the room with his fiancée at his side and a half-dozen colleagues gathered like an eager audience. I, of course, stood just behind him, deliberately invisible. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, lifting his glass. His voice pitched to carry across the nearest tables. "Tonight is not just about celebrating another successful year at Technova. It's about recognizing the future. A future built on innovation, energy, and yes, courage." There were murmurs of approval, a few polite claps. He was in his element, glowing with borrowed light. And speaking of courage, he continued, turning slightly so the crowd could see me at his side. "I'd like to introduce someone very important to me, my father." The eyes of the group shifted toward me. I inclined my head politely, offering nothing more. My son smiled, but there was a sharpened edge to it, a confidence that needed an audience. "Now, don't be fooled. My dad's, well, let's just say he's enjoying retirement these days. A quiet life, gardening, newspapers, the occasional crossword. Not exactly boardroom material, if you know what I mean." A ripple of awkward laughter. My daughter's face flushed. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat nearby. But my son mistook the unease for amusement, pressing forward. He's old school, the kind of guy who still believes hard work means putting in the hours, not adapting to new markets. Honestly, he wouldn't last 5 minutes in the world we operate in now. The words hung heavy. For a moment, no one spoke. The laughter faltered, replaced by something quieter. More dangerous silence, because Walter Klein had arrived. He stood at the edge of the group, his presence commanding without effort, his gaze fixed not on my son, but on me. His eyes dropped briefly, just enough to catch the gleam of the cufflinks on my wrist, the platinum logo that had carried 30 years of sacrifice. Recognition flashed across his face, sharp and undeniable, and with it came a shift in the room itself. Conversations dimmed, heads turned. The jazz trio played softer, as though the music itself leaned in to listen. "Is that so?" Walter's voice cut through the hush, calm but resonant. He stepped forward, his hand resting on my shoulder with a familiarity that froze my son mid-sentence. "Funny, Derek, because I'd say your father lasted more than 5 minutes. In fact, he lasted 3 decades, long enough to build the very foundation you're standing on." The silence became absolute. Champagne glasses hovered in midair. My son's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a man grasping for air in deep water. Walter smiled, not the polite smile of a CEO, but the warm, personal smile of an old friend. He turned back to me. "Good to see you, partner." The word landed like a thunderclap. Partner. Around us, the circle of colleagues shifted. Eyes widened. A few gasps slipped into the silence. And my son, caught in the blinding light of truth, could do nothing but stand there, stripped of the mask he had so carefully crafted. For months, he had built his identity on arrogance, dismissing the past as irrelevant. But in that single moment, with one word, the past returned, not as a ghost, but as a foundation too solid to ignore. The stage he had built for his triumph had become the stage of his undoing, and the night was far from over. The ballroom was no longer a celebration. It was a courtroom. Glasses that had once clinked in merriment were frozen halfway to lips. Conversations that had buzzed with ambition now died on tongues. Every pair of eyes in that golden room turned toward our circle, waiting, watching, as if some unannounced verdict was about to be read. Walter's hand still rested firmly on my shoulder, grounding me with a weight that spoke of 3 decades of trust, his voice steady and clear. Carried across the room, "Derek, tell me again, what was it you said about dead weight?" The words cut sharper than any blade. My son stammered, his face pale, his confidence evaporating under the gaze of his colleagues, his fiancée, the board members. I only meant," Walter's eyes narrowed. "You meant what?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence gave his words a power greater than thunder. "That those who built this company, those who sacrificed years of their lives, are nothing but obstacles." "I didn't know," my son blurted out, desperation creeping into his voice. "I didn't realize," Walter's jaw tightened. "You didn't realize who your father was, or you didn't realize that respect isn't conditional on knowing someone's resume." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodded. A few whispered, but no one dared look away. My son stood exposed. Every careless word he had spoken over the past months now replaying itself in the minds of those who had heard them. I remained silent. My role was not to strike, it was to bear witness. My son's fiancée clutched his arm, her eyes wide with shock. "Derek," she whispered, though the room was so hushed that everyone heard it. "How could you?" He tried to regain footing, straightening his tie with trembling fingers. I was speaking about business strategy, about efficiency. Not about him personally, but Walter did not let him escape. "Not personally." His voice dripped with disdain. "You insulted a man you didn't know, dismissed him as irrelevant while wearing the suit bought with the success he bled for. You thought arrogance was vision, you thought disrespect was strength, and you thought we wouldn't notice." The room held its breath. Finally, I lifted my head and spoke for the first time that evening. My voice was quiet, but it carried. "Son, the lesson isn't about who I am. It's about who you chose to be when you thought I was no one." The words struck deeper than Walter's thunder. Because they were not judgment, they were truth. My son's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years, shame. His lips parted as though to argue, to explain, to defend, but nothing came. The verdict had already been delivered, not by me, not even by Walter, but by the silence of that ballroom. In the reflection of crystal chandeliers, surrounded by glass and light, my son finally saw himself clearly. And what stared back at him was not the future leader he had imagined, but the debt of disrespect come due. The ballroom had become a cathedral of silence. No one moved. The chandeliers gleamed coldly overhead, throwing fractured light onto faces frozen in anticipation. Walter broke that silence first. "Derek Harrington," he said, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of a gavel. "For months you've spoken of trimming dead weight. For months you've dismissed wisdom as stagnation. And tonight you humiliated the man who built the very ground you're standing on. Tell me, how can a man who disrespects his own father lead anyone?" The words rolled across the marble floor, sharp as thunder. Every face turned toward my son, who stood trembling, stripped of his carefully crafted confidence. He began, but his throat closed on the word. His hands trembled at his sides. His fiancée's grip on his arm was no longer one of pride, but of fear. Walter's eyes hardened. "On Monday morning you will meet with human resources. You will explain to them your definition of leadership, and you will answer for the words you've spoken about your colleagues, your seniors, and your partner's legacy. Your position here," he paused, letting the weight sink in, "is no longer secure." Gasps rippled through the room. Some covered their mouths, others exchanged glances, but no one spoke. My son's face went pale, the color draining as quickly as the confidence had. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." Walter did not soften. "Ignorance is not an excuse. Respect is owed to every human being, not just to the ones you think matter." And then all eyes turned to me. I had been silent all evening, a witness to my son's arrogance, his unraveling, and now his humiliation. But this was the moment that would decide the lesson. Would I let the hammer fall fully, or would I guide it into something more enduring? I took a step forward, my cufflinks catching the chandelier's light, and placed a hand gently on Walter's arm. "Enough," I said quietly. The word cut through the tension, not with thunder, but with stillness. The room leaned in. "Walter," I continued, "justice has been served tonight. My son has seen his reflection. He has felt the weight of his words. To destroy his career completely would teach him fear. But to temper justice with mercy," I glanced at my son, whose eyes brimmed with shame, "that might just teach him respect." Walter studied me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "Very well," he said. "Derek will keep his position, but under probation, 6 months. Every word, every action will be watched. One misstep and he's gone." Relief flooded my son's face, but it was not the relief of victory. It was the fragile relief of a man who has been spared barely from the fire of his own making. I turned to him, meeting his eyes fully for the first time that night. "Son," I said gently, "remember this: respect is not measured in promotions or paychecks. It's measured in how you treat the people you think you can afford to ignore." His lips trembled. He nodded. I understand, Dad, I do." The jazz trio began to play again, softly at first, as if the music itself was testing the room's pulse. Conversations resumed in cautious murmurs. The chandeliers no longer gleamed so coldly. The room exhaled as though a storm had passed. Walter clapped me on the shoulder, his old grin returning. "Partner," he said, warmth returning to his voice, 30 years and you still know how to turn a boardroom into a classroom." I smiled faintly. The best lessons are the ones learned in public. And as the room slowly returned to life, I realized the story of that night would echo far beyond its walls, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a reminder that arrogance without respect always collapses. And that mercy, when offered at the right moment, has the power to transform. The house was silent when we returned. No jazz trio, no chandeliers, no crystal glasses raised in judgment. Just the steady tick of the old clock in the hallway and the faint creak of the wooden floor as we stepped inside. My son moved like a man carrying chains. His tie hung loose around his neck, his jacket wrinkled from restless hands. He sat heavily on the couch, burying his face in his palms. For the first time in years, the armor of confidence was gone. What remained was not the ambitious manager or the self-assured speaker. It was just a boy, weary and frightened, who had been caught in his own lies. I hung my jacket on the stand, removed my cufflinks, and placed them gently in their box on the table. Their silver gleam looked different here, less like weapons, more like relics, symbols of a journey he had never truly known. For a long while I said nothing. Silence is its own teacher. Finally my son broke it. His voice was hoarse, thick with regret. "Dad, I'm sorry." The words trembled as if foreign on his tongue. He rubbed his face, his shoulders slumping under the weight of everything that had collapsed. I didn't know who you were, what you'd done, I thought." He stopped, shaking his head. "I thought you were just ordinary." I lowered myself into the armchair across from him, folding my hands. "And tell me, son, would that have made me less deserving of your respect?" He looked up, startled. His mouth opened, but no answer came. "That's the lesson you missed," I continued softly. "It was never about whether you knew I co-founded Technova. It was about how you treated me when you thought I hadn't." Tears welled in his eyes. He blinked rapidly, as if ashamed to let them fall. "I was stupid. I thought success was about money, titles, who notices you at a gala. I wanted so badly to prove myself that his voice cracked, that I forgot what matters." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. "Ambition is not the enemy, Derek, but ambition without respect will eat you alive. I know because I've seen it destroy men stronger than you." He buried his face in his hands again. "I don't deserve this job. I don't deserve—" "Stop." My voice was firm but not unkind. "Walter was right. You will face consequences. 6 months of probation. Every eye on you. That will be your test. And you will not pass it by numbers or deals or hours worked. You will pass it only if you learn to lift others, not step on them." The silence stretched. At last he nodded slowly, his shoulders trembling. I stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out an old photograph. It was yellowed at the edges, the corners worn. 2 young men in a cramped garage, grease on their hands, determination in their eyes. Walter and me. I placed it on the table in front of him. "This is where it began," I said. "Not in boardrooms, not at galas, here. With dirt under our nails and a dream we couldn't afford to let die." He stared at the photo for a long time, his fingers tracing the edges. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely a whisper. "Teach me, Dad, please." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness yet, not fully. That takes time, but hope that perhaps the seeds of humility had finally found soil. I leaned back in my chair, my voice quiet but steady. "Lesson 15, I said. "Respect is not earned by climbing over others. It's earned by remembering whose shoulders you're standing on." He nodded, tears slipping silently down his face. And for the first time in years, the silence between us was not a wall, but a bridge. The days after the gala passed more quietly. No more grand speeches from my son, no more laughter too loud, no more careless words about dead weight. Instead, there was something else, hesitation, reflection. He arrived one evening with a notebook of his own, sat at my kitchen table, wrote furiously while I trimmed the roses outside. When I asked what he was doing, he muttered, "Writing down lessons." I said nothing, but inside I smiled. The world often believes wisdom comes from brilliance, but more often it comes from bruises. From stumbling in public, from tasting the bitterness of one's own arrogance, and from the quiet realization that dignity isn't granted by a title, but by how you treat others when no one is watching. One night, as we sat in the living room, the same couch where shame had broken him weeks earlier, he asked, "Dad, will I ever earn back your respect?" I looked at him for a long moment, then answered gently, "Respect isn't a prize you earn once, it's a choice you make every day. And yes, son, you can start today." His shoulders dropped, relief mixing with resolve. I knew then that the real work was not what happened in boardrooms or in lavish galas under chandeliers. The real work was here, quiet, steady, unseen by crowds. It was the work of humility, of choosing kindness over cleverness, of remembering that every success story is written on the sacrifices of those who came before. And perhaps that's the final lesson I will leave you with tonight. Respect should not be conditional on resumes, salaries, or last names. Respect is the language of humanity. Strip away our titles, our cufflinks, our tailored suits, and what remains is the simple truth. Every person you meet deserves dignity until they prove otherwise. As for my son, his story is still being written. I will not tell you whether he becomes a better later or if the weight of his pride drags him down again. That choice is his alone, but for the first time I believe he sees the road more clearly. And for me, I am content, because sometimes the most powerful role of a father is not to fight his son's battles, but to stand quietly nearby until the moment comes when silence teaches more than words ever could. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own father, your own lessons, your own scars, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, join this community, and share your story with us. Because in the end, stories are how we keep respect alive across generations.